So welcome. Michaela Daystar is here with us. I'm super excited to have her. Michaela is a Reiki teacher and owner of Heartscapes, which is down in Davis, California. Super excited to have you back on. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. And so as you may have seen before, Michaela had a conversation with us previously on trauma-informed consent. And so she is like my go-to connection conversationalist on these kind of harder topics, because she's a wealth of information and really inspires me and many of our students here at Reiki Cafe Radio and Reiki Cafe Community, Reiki Cafe University, all of the things on really like, let's have those conversations. Let's really dive in deep to where can we stand in our integrity? Where can we really hold the Reiki precepts to their highest potential while we're holding space for our clients? So we wanted to dive into this conversation about spiritual bypassing. So before we start in, I'd love to just invite you, Michaela, to kind of share some of your background, of some of your area of expertise that gives you some confidence in speaking on these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like my work right now, especially the conversations that you and I have got to have, really is a blending together of like my current work around Reiki, around holding space for self-reflection and spiritual development in community, and my previous career in social justice leadership development in universities and nonprofits. And so that was about a 12-year period of really specifically cultivating the leadership capacities of students and nonprofit employees around social justice topics that were of importance to them. And that work allowed me the privilege to receive a lot of training and a lot of access to conversations that weren't happening, widely in society, or to have maybe a preview of conversations that would become more commonplace in society years before they happened. And I really take that privilege seriously, because I feel like it offers a window into a lot of interpersonal dynamics that, we don't necessarily pay attention to when they're not in our face all the time. And one of the things that became really prominent to me inside of those spaces was that ultimately caused me to leave that space, is that in the way that I was doing that work in the context, there wasn't a lot of space for integrating self-reflection, spiritual practice, creativity, things that were really, high values for me and of importance to me. And I could see the impact that was having on folks, not being able to bring those sides of themselves into this really challenging, really emotionally triggering work. And I wanted to create spaces where people could do that work of kind of mining the interior of their own experience and really building resilience and kind of clearing out the trauma that they that maybe was what inspired them to want to make change in society in the first place. And so that was, kind of the impetus for this transition into working in realms like Reiki that were supportive in my process of doing that. And then what I found on the flip side is that enmeshed in this world of spiritual practice and development, and particularly in realms around Western Reiki and various related modalities, that there was almost an opposite challenge that was happening, where those conversations that had become so commonplace to me around what it means to be trauma informed, what it means to have conversations around privilege, topics like spiritual bypassing, that those conversations were not happening inside of these spaces. And so, I felt like I had this kind of unique window into the places where both of these sides of our human experience, right, the interpersonal need to create spaces that reflect our values, that reflect justice, that reflect equity for all people, and then the interior spaces of doing personal, spiritual, reflective work, creative work, that those places needed to blend together for us to really have a fully functioning society. And I can see really clearly, at least, from my limited windows into those places, where that intersection is and is not happening. And the good news is that intersection is happening more and more. We're seeing it show up in a lot more prominent people's work. Adrienne Marie Brown comes to mind. Renee Brown comes to mind. So there's a lot more of these conversations happening on the mainstream. And it's exciting to be able to have them just on the ground in our day-to-day work like we're having today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's so needed. Like, I've been in this industry for a lot of years, and I'm like, we're not having these conversations that really need to be had to be able to fully support our students, our clients to the fullest capacity that we are able, to really be sensitive to what their needs are. And so thank you so much for your vulnerability, for stepping outside of the norm and being like, let's have these conversations. And, if you're listening and this is just another opportunity to have these conversations with your own clients, with your own students, and feel free to share this episode, these recordings, so that the conversation can continue. And that's the hope, that we're sparking a dialogue, we're sparking a conversation starter, so that we can talk about it, that this doesn't have to be something that is scary or that is too rigid, that we start the healing by bringing in awareness. We're bringing the awareness so that we can start the healing process, because it's needed in the spiritual industry. So while we're talking about this, I'd love just to get your definition of where this term spiritual bypassing came from, to really kind of like start us off, because I think if we all can have a clear, this is the definition, then we can really get to what are we talking about.
Absolutely. And like with so many of these kinds of terms and concepts, there's been an evolution in how this term shows up in society. So it was actually coined back in the 80s by a psychotherapist named John Wellwood. And he was one of the people who really started working a lot with transpersonal psychology and realms of psychology and psychotherapy that did pay attention to spiritual practices and spiritual life as not only relevant to a client's personal experience, but also to therapy as a practice. And so he wrote a book, I just want to make sure I get the title right, Towards a Psychology of Awakening. And inside of that book, he used the term spiritual bypassing for kind of the first time in a formal way and defined it in this way. He says, spiritual bypassing means using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep personal, emotional, unfinished business, to shore up a shaky sense of self, or to belittle basic needs, feelings, and developmental tasks. Mm-hmm. And so largely he was referring to almost a self-defeating process, right? So in this context, he's primarily speaking of ways in which we can sometimes use our spiritual practices and concepts to sidestep work that we need to do on ourselves in a therapeutic sense, is what he's referring to here. And so, that might look like an overemphasis on the positive versus the negative, an unwillingness to look at our shadowy places, because that would be, calling attention to bad things, and we want to only focus on good things. It might look like, a sense of entitlement around concepts like enlightenment, an overly inflated sense of how far along on the path we might be towards something we might call enlightenment, a connection, an overemphasis or an over-connection to a spirituality that we might think of as being dissociative, like leaving the realm of the here and now to live primarily in an idealized sense of, what a spiritual life might look like, and just kind of not dealing with the here and now. So a lot of these things, can impact us personally, and can halt the personal development work that we're doing. And I would argue, and I think Wellwood would argue, also is purpose defeating when we look at really what the purpose of a spiritual practice is meant to be. So it's stifling both a therapeutic process and a spiritual practice at the same time when we're using these ideas to sidestep really doing some of the difficult work that we need to do inside of ourselves in order to grow and to change. And so that initial definition, again, primarily focused on the self and the self work that we need to do. We now understand the ways in which that kind of process can then turn outward into our interpersonal relationships. Because if we're not willing to look at our own shadows, if we're not willing to look at our own, places of dysfunction, of, unhealthy habits, of self-sabotage, then we're certainly not going to be willing to listen to other people report to us about the way those things are impacting them, or the way in which the cultures that we're creating inside of our practice or inside of our business or inside of our relationships are negatively impacting them, right? And so then we get to an iteration of spiritual bypassing that's about the way in which we can use these spiritual concepts to bypass, to get around difficult conversations with other people. So, if we just take a step back and say, well, the word, what does the words mean? Bypass meaning to go around something, right? Spiritual meaning spiritual practices. And so using spiritual practices to get around or get out of having a difficult conversation that we don't want to have or not ready to have, or to face something or to make a change, to receive a criticism, to self-reflect about a way in which our behavior or our habits or our communication, just what we're doing, might be negatively impacting other people in a way that's a problem. And so, we really need to hold both of those sides in the conversation, the way in which we can spiritually bypass our own work, and the way that that inevitably extends out to the way that we're going to bypass other people in our work.
So maybe we can take this conversation and kind of have a segment of like, let's look at how we spiritual bypass ourselves, and then how that overflows into our relationships, our clients, our students, and how that looks. Because I think when we can really do that self-reflection of like, how is this showing up in my life? Where am I, quote unquote, positive vibes only myself, so that I'm not looking at my shadow, and really feeling into, we all have stuff. We all have trauma. We all have triggers. We all have things to work on. And it's part of our spiritual journey. It's part of our spiritual processing to do that work. And when we are trying to just stay in that, I feel like that positive mindset vibe, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the, I think a good point of self-reflection and kind of almost a marker that if we care about this, right, we might not actually want to deal with this at all, right? We might want to bypass this whole conversation. But if we care about this and we'd like to be more attentive to the way in which this might show up in our life, and we'll get into some specific examples of that to help us think through that, then we want to start noticing some markers that we can look for in ourselves. And for me, a marker that showed up early on in my process of kind of working through some traumatic things that then led me to doing work with Reiki was a sensation that I had somehow arrived at a place of healing. I had done a lot of work. I had worked with a number of practitioners. I had done a year of Codependence Anonymous to deal with some messed up behavior from way back in my childhood. And I got to this point where I felt like I'd really arrived at a place of like healing and transformation, as if like that was all the work that I had to do, right? I had done maybe 2 years of intense self-reflection, and I had arrived. And certainly I had changed. Certainly I had experienced growth. Certainly I was less triggered by things. I was more aware of problematic behavior, and I had made some changes in them. But that idea, that thought that because of that, I am now arrived where I need to be as a completely whole and healed human, in retrospect, was an indication that there was some spiritual bypassing going on for myself, about myself. And, I remember a situation where a particular dynamic with a particular person in my life that I had thought that I had gotten past and was not going to respond in those old ways anymore, cycled around again. And that same response came, and that feeling of like, but I fixed this. Like, I did this already, right? Why is this thing coming back around? I'm already done, right? And so, I would just offer that, sensation of like, well, I've already done the work. I've arrived, as maybe a cue that we might need to settle back into some self-reflection, right? Because truly, right, transformation and change continues to happen throughout our life. And, while it certainly could be true as esoteric Buddhists, for example, Shingon Buddhists, for example, which is the roots, part of the roots of Reiki, believe that we can attain enlightenment in a single lifetime. While that may be possible, I know I'm not there yet. So, until we have reached that state, we need to be really humble about where we actually are in our journey. So yeah, just kind of one specific example from my past around a sudden awareness that I had been spiritually bypassing myself.
Yeah, I have a similar experience where there a little bit of like comparisonitis, like, and that was last week's podcast episode of going, oh, I am better than, or I've worked through all of my things, and just really coming from that egoic place of like, I am the quote unquote Reiki master teacher, and therefore I have more knowledge, wisdom, evolution than these other people. Like, and I remember having this conversation with the client slash student, and I was like, and afterwards I was like, existential crisis. I was like, oh my God, this is not okay. Like,
Yeah.
Where did that come from? It just was like ripping off of a Band-Aid of going, oh, right, we need a back step, like 10 steps of going, who was that? She needs some healing, and she needs to get down from that pedestal, because that is not okay.
And then we go back to our precepts and we say, just for today, I'm grateful. Just for today, I'm humble. Just for today, I can see my life exactly it is, and I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful for this next step of learning that I get to do, right? And that was one of the things that came out of that experience where I felt this backsliding and had a teacher, that I was complaining to say, what makes you think you're done? Like, why do you think that you're never going to run into these patterns again? And I, in that moment, reframed to, oh, I don't have to do this again. I get to do this again. Even if I don't want to, even if it's hard, even if I have all kinds of feelings about it, like I get to continue doing this work on myself. And I feel like that's an important framing when we want to resist spiritually bypassing ourselves or others, is that like, it is a privilege to have the time and space and resources in my life to devote significant time to understanding myself better and improving myself and, becoming a better human being, becoming happier, right? It's a privilege to get to work on being happier as a person, right?
Absolutely.
And so I get to do that, right? And I get to keep doing that for as long as it takes.
Yeah. And I love that reframe of like, I should do this. I have to do this. It's going to be hard, to, I get to, I choose to, I continue to work on myself because I'm worthy of that healing. And it's this constant coming back to our daily practices, knowing that those triggers, we're going to have triggers, but the goal is to make that easier and easier so that we know what to do when those things come up. So it's not, it gets to be easier, but it's not all of a sudden gone. It's always there's always going to be some type of underlying layer of work left to do. And it's shifting into the ease and flow of it.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Mm-hmm. So curious about I feel like in the community, in the spiritual industry, I should say, not in our Reiki community necessarily, but definitely in the spiritual industry, you get a lot of like positive vibes only. This like, keep your mindset on the positive and then you won't attract the negative. And if you do, it's your fault. Like this kind of blame game going on. What's your take on all of that?
Yeah, there's so much there. My first initial take is that this is the residue of the Calvinist origins of our country, right? A particular branch of Christianity that was what was brought here initially, that looks at the material success in a person's life and sees that as evidence of their virtue. So that if you have succeeded, if you are doing well in your profession, in your family, in your life, then that is evidence that you are a good person and you're being blessed by God. And I didn't even know that that was going to be the answer that came out of my mind. But when you when you said, this, you started naming some of these tropes that we hear repeated, right? The good vibes only, the attract the positive things, not the negative. The Reiki can cause no harm, which is one that we might circle back to. Where did that come from? My mind just jumped back to like, what's the origin story of the culture that we live in, right? And that's part of it, is this belief that when good things are happening in our life, it is evidence of our virtue and God's blessing. And when bad things happen in our life, we're misfortunate, we're not successful, then that is a clear sign that you're a bad person, that you're morally corrupt in some way. You've made mistakes that you haven't atoned for yet, and therefore you're being punished. Right. And so we can see that, we can see hints of that when we talk about the idea that, if something is continually bad coming into your life, then clearly you must be doing something to cause it. Now, we have to be careful here, because certainly we can do things that cause bad things to happen to us, right? Certainly we make bad choices and have misfortune and, all of these things. But if we codify this as a spiritual law, right, that this is how it works, that if you focused your mind well enough on the positive, then you will only attract the positive to you, then we open the door for some really ugly things. We open the door to disregard the complexity of our life and to disregard things like systemic oppression that stacks the likelihood of misfortune against some people over others, and that has happened over a long period of time. And so, that would be the part of the context that I would want us to hold this into. The other side of the context, bringing it back to the personal, is that these kinds of spiritual bypasses, where, for example, somebody, say we're holding a Reiki class, and say we're teaching that Reiki class, and we don't mention anything about the Japanese origins of Reiki. And perhaps a student brings that up and says, hey, I'm a little uncomfortable that we're learning about this practice, but you're not teaching us anything about where it came from or any of the cultural context. And I'm curious about that. I'm a little uncomfortable about that. How do we respond in that moment? Right? Because that's a little bit of a, that can be a really uncomfortable thing to be named. It's a vulnerable thing for a teacher to experience, of like, oh, I'm being told I'm not doing something right. And I'm not doing something right around a legacy of cultural appropriation, a legacy of erasure of the history and the lives of non-white people in this country. And now that's being named here in this class. How do I respond to that? One response could be to own that. Wow, you're right. That I can see why that is a problem, and that's something that I'll do better about. I probably need to research that more and, intentionally bring that into class more. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Or we might not have actually done enough work on ourselves to be able to deal with the discomfort of that. Right? We might get so uncomfortable with that call out. We might get so uncomfortable being named as somebody who's maybe, not holding full integrity in our practice, that we bypass the conversation. Oh, well, there's good reasons why we don't talk about that. This Reiki is its own entity. It doesn't matter. It's outside of culture. It's outside of religion. Those origins don't really matter, because Reiki is just alive, and it changes, and it shows up in our life however it shows. And so, those things don't matter. Right. And so we can see in an answer like that, and I'm paraphrasing actual comments that I've seen, right? So this is like from life, inside of conversations that I've been a part of around things like cultural appropriation, where we've got this response that bypasses the comment, that bypasses the legitimate discomfort that student had with being dissociated, disconnected from the roots of what they were learning. And we see this happen in so many different ways, where a person brings something difficult to an individual or to a group and is shut down because that person can't tolerate having that conversation. Now that might be because their ego is too inflated, they've got too much on the line, you know, they need to be seen as an authority, so they can't be seen as, you know, being wrong. They might not be able to navigate a difficult conversation. They might have been in their own spirit, like they might have been spiritually bypassing themselves for so long that they just can't stay grounded enough to have that difficult conversation. I think so much of this comes down to an inability to be uncomfortable, right? Because these conversations are uncomfortable. And if we can't tolerate the sensation of discomfort, we haven't actually integrated our spiritual practice in a way that it helps us with that in the moment, then we're going to fail in these moments, right? We're going to collapse, you know, in on ourselves. Or maybe, you know, maybe it's not like bypassing, but maybe it's like collapsing into shame, right? You know, I've had a moment of that where, you know, back when I was teaching social justice leadership, where I was called out on something that I wasn't handling well in a class that I was leading, and I was not prepared for the discomfort of that. And I just broke down in tears in the middle of this class. And while on the one hand, my feelings were legitimate, right? On the other hand, my expression in that moment was not holding the space well. And it was bypassing the criticism that needed to be addressed. It was bringing the attention to my pain and discomfort and sadness and shame, and away from the legitimate criticism that had been made. And so these are the kinds of dynamics that have a lot of subtlety, but ultimately what it comes down to is, are we prepared to be uncomfortable well enough to hold a space for complexity, which is simply the way that life is. It is complex. And when we're holding spaces of vulnerability for groups of people, this stuff is going to come up. There's going to be uncomfortable things that we are asked to deal with. And how we show up in those moments matters a whole lot.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like when we can own our humanness and go and own our, like, I don't know the answer to that. Let me research it for you. Let's get back to you. Maybe I can bring in a guest speaker who can really dive into the history of this, whatever it is. Like, I feel like as teachers, if we are in that position of teaching and continuing the practice, spreading Reiki, we need to be very comfortable being uncomfortable and admitting when we don't know all of the things. We're not going to know all of the things. We don't have a PhD. We haven't studied to the capacity of the level that we aren't going to know all of the things. We just can't. Right. And so when it's, and owning that and going, okay, I don't have the answer in this moment. Now, how can I respond and still honor the question?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
This is such an important point, Christine, because another one of the factors kind of culturally and personally that impacts this is our culture's obsession with perfection. We're a culture that is highly oriented around productivity and success. And so perfectionism comes really strongly with that as a mental health challenge that many people have, right? They need to be perfect. They need to be seen as flawless. The idea that if we make a mistake, if we're not perfect, if we admit to not knowing something, as you just suggested, is an antidote to this, right? Then we are going to fail, right? Again, back to that is a clear indication that I am not chosen. I am not worthy. I am not being blessed. And so I need to hold on to that blessing as much as I can. And so I need to put forward this, this front of being perfect. And when we do that, we are going to fail in these conversations because, as you just said, we can never know. We can never be perfect in what we bring and what we do. We will always make mistakes, no matter how much we prepare or study or research. The challenge, though, is how do we respond in that moment? Mm-hmm. I had a Tai Chi teacher who, was incredibly graceful and beautiful in the way that she moved. And she was teaching us a particular thing. And one of the other students who just was, feeling like she was fumbling with this said, Sensei, how do you make these movements so perfect? How do you just land them every single time? And she kind of laughed at him. She was a Zen practitioner and was very, very quirky and funny. She kind of laughed at him. She says, it's not about perfection. It's about finding grace in the adjustment. She says, I make mistakes all the time, but you don't see them because I handle them with grace. I lean into those mistakes and I shift and I move. And so, that's part of again, the remedy here is where do we find, how can we find grace in those moments when we've made a mistake? And when we make that a practice, and when we draw on the tools that our practices give us, right? The precepts give us a roadmap on how to do this, right? It gives us, a roadmap on how to release our attachment to being afraid of screwing up, release our attachment to anger about that person who called us out, rooting ourselves into gratitude and humility and deep compassion for ourselves when we screw up, deep compassion for others when they screw up against us. When we are able to do that and practice those things diligently, then we find grace in these moments of mistake. We own them. We stand tall in the midst of them, and we make the adjustment that is needed, right? We don't just apologize. We don't just, okay, yeah, I messed up. We make the adjustment, right? We make the change, whatever that looks like. That change might be imperfect, right? But we find a way, as you said, to respond to the moment. Right. And oftentimes that does require us to make our circle wider. You said, bring in a speaker, bring in an expert, right? Get some help. It makes our circles bigger. It makes our heart bigger. It makes us better.
And
right?
it allows our students to see that displayed so that they also know that they don't necessarily need all of the answers, but they have to be willing to widen their circle. And so this is about that expansion, that heart-centered expansion of the practice, going, I'm not the guru. I don't have all the answers, nor do I want to be. I want to be able to be collaborative, to be open-minded and flexible in these conversations. And so, and remembering, like, if you tell a student that you're going to find that answer, your job is then to go find the answer, get back to them, share it with the whole class, and then adjust your teachings in the future.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm like having aha moments over here, because I think you're absolutely correct. It totally comes down to our culture and the way our culture has become around, we give all of this emphasis to the crown chakra, like it's very interesting when yoga moved into the States, everything was about enlightenment and upper chakras, and let's just ignore all the earthly things, right? And
Yep.
where's all of our stuff held? It's typically in the lower three chakras.
Because that maps onto our Christian
Yes.
roots, right? Of course, we want to be in heaven, right? We don't want to be down in those below places, right? We don't want to be down in those underworld places. Those are the bad places. That's where we're trying to spend our whole life not going, right? It's a totally different worldview, right? Where we say, no, that the deep under places are where fertility lives. It's where nourishment lives. It's where, it's where all of our resources live. We have to be deeply rooted before we can start looking up there, right? We need to be rooted before we can reach. And we have to be balanced between those two places before we can come to true connection, right? And this is the map that Reiki gives us. This is the map that the Shinto origins of Reiki gives us, is the three diamonds of the hara, the head, and the heart, in that order. We work the earth first, we work our roots first, and then eventually we come to the heart, eventually we come to the head, right? But we don't start there, or we float away.
And I feel like so many people in the spiritual industry, they're so up in there, like everything is in their crown, everything is third eye oriented. And I'm like, yeah, if we go there, then you are not going to have any groundedness. You are not going to connect this to our 3D life reality here in the real world. And then what is the point? Is the point to reach enlightenment and to leave this world while we still have physical form? Or is it to live and be and embody all of our spiritual truths, rooted and grounded in that, so that we can then share it authentically?
Right. And this practice gives us vast amounts of roadmaps and tools to do that.
Absolutely.
Right? It calls our attention to the integration of the body in with the mind, the heart, the spirit, and to work with the body first, because that's our first gateway to understanding anything, to perceiving anything, is through the body. And we cannot forsake the body, because that's where God lives. That's where spirit lives as far as our direct experience goes. And we look out to life and we see the trees and we see the birds and we see the soil and we see the roots in the ground. That's where God lives, right? That's where it's observable, right? And so if we can't connect to that, then we certainly can't connect out to the heavens, out to the celestials, out to the aliens, or whatever, we want to think about and conceive out there, right? We need to be connected with our own roots in the ground and the web of life that's here.
Yeah.
And by doing that from a spiritual perspective and using practices that continuously call our attention to that and call our attention to the integration of our body with our mind, our heart, and our spirit, then we find ourselves more resilient in these kinds of conversations, right? There's many, many, many amazing outcomes to doing that. But one of them relative to this conversation is that we find ourselves able to be uncomfortable because we feel resourced, right? If we don't feel grounded and we don't feel connected to this vast web of resources that this planet gives us, that life itself gives us, of course, we're going to be too uncomfortable to talk about how we made a mistake,
Right.
or explore the ways in which we've been complicit in systems of oppression and how that shows up in our work. I mean, come on, that's hard stuff, but it's essential. It's essential to do those kinds of investigations, and we have to be resourced or we're going to fail.
Yeah. And I feel like it's very interesting, since I've been in the spiritual industry for so long, just watching it transform and seeing what the hype is of currents, like 10 years ago, it was like the law of attraction and the movie The Secret and all of these things. And everyone got on this high vibe path, but then there was like a spiritual fallout underneath it. And then all of the workers who are really calling forth to do the shadow work, to do the deeper work, because the law of attraction was just doing surface. And I think there is some validity to it, but it also is ripe for spiritual bypassing, especially when we're playing the blame game and pointing fingers. Well, of course that happened to you. You attracted that abuse. You attracted that rape. You attracted whatever it is. And that's just not okay. That's just not okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I kind of joked, before we jumped on this live, is, the concept of non-duality, which underpins the Buddhist roots of Reiki, this is a masterclass in how to work with that. Because yes, there's something incredibly powerful and valid about the importance of holding possibility and positivity in our mindset, right? Absolutely, right? If we are continuously bogged down by focusing on everything that's horrible, absolutely that impacts the way we feel, the way we think, the way we behave, and therefore what becomes possible in our life. But if we say to ourselves and to other people, you can only think about the positive, and if you think about or you name the negative, then there's something wrong with you. Right? That's what you're speaking to. And that's where we start getting into not being able to actually transcend the work. And so we have to be able to lean into the space of non-duality where both things can be true, right? It's important to name the negative things in our life. I was just, when you were talking, I was kind of chuckling to myself because this showed up in a dynamic of a certain friendship where, I would name something that was bothering me or complain about something, and he would be really quick to shut it down. Oh, don't talk about that. You're going to, you only want to talk about the positive, law of attraction. And it became this whole other frustration that I'm not allowed to say that this thing is bothering me. This thing is a problem. I'm not allowed to just speak it. Right? I'm not allowed to say, God, this traffic sucks. I was working a job that had a 2-hour commute for 7 years. And it wrecked my body to be in the car that much. And part of choosing to change that dynamic required me to confront the fact that was a problem. But if I'm not allowed to say, God, this sucks, it sucks being in this car for 2 hours. I hate this, if I'm not allowed to even express that, then how am I going to take action around it? How am I going to make a change in my life if I'm not allowed to look at the things that are negative? And so we want to be able to hold this, again, this nuance, this subtlety of being grounded enough to be able to deal with the negative things without getting sucked into them all the time, right? So that when we focus on the positivity, it's with authenticity, it's with clarity, right? It's not in this like blind, like, I just don't want to look at that, so I'm going to only look over here kind of mentality.
Right.
And I don't know how we're doing on time, but, I'm thinking of specific examples of conversations I've had in the context of Reiki and in the context of how we create cultures of nuance inside of Reiki that, really have illustrated this for me over the last couple of years.
Yeah. Well, and I think so many people come to the Reiki world for personal healing, like they have things going on in their body that needs to be addressed. And once we can, and this is one of my favorite conversations. I use the chakras as a roadmap to physical healing. If we can figure out what the physical ailment is and what's the emotions behind it correlated to the right chakra, we can really start digging and doing that work. And so if we just cut people off going, just don't focus on it, that's not, we need, and part of it, like, I love Reiki and that it's just like, let's just listen to our hands. Where does it need to go? Where does it need to move? Where does it need to shift? We need to get out of our head around that, but also you need to know what you don't want so you can choose what you do want.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to be able to see it. So before we wrap up, I would love to kind of circle back to a very difficult phrase that's often thrown around in the Reiki world. And you mentioned it earlier, and I do want to hit on it because I feel like education around this is so needed. And that's the term Reiki can do no harm.
Yeah.
And right.
One that was on my mind a minute ago. Yeah.
It's so heavy, and we say it all the time. We see it all the time. And it is like this Reiki in and of itself, the energy, pure energy itself isn't doing the harm, but we're human in the practice. And so I'd love for you to speak on that.
Yeah. And that phrase was really an opening point for me to start working on a lot of these in conversation with other people, a lot of these experiences I'd had and, thoughts that I'd had over the years that really, were pressing inside of me to be expressed. And it was that phrase that really finally inspired me to really say it. And so it was around the work that I've developed around trauma-informed Reiki and the encouragement of us as a community to understand the ways in which different people are going to show up with different types of hurts, and that there are things that we might do that might seem perfectly fine to us, but that might be harmful to other people, and that there's a certain amount of awareness we can cultivate around that. There's certain practices we can develop to avoid some of that, mitigate some of that, confront mistakes when we've made them, and so on. And one of the things that seemed to be a roadblock to that was this concept that Reiki can do no harm. And the reason I say that is I was seeing this come up in conversations on different forums and in different community spaces, where somebody would name an uncomfortable or painful or confusing experience that they'd had either in a Reiki session or a class or a self, moment of self-practice that they were confused by or alarmed by, hurt by. And they would bring it up, what do I do about this? How do I understand this? And so often at least some of the responses, not all, but some of the responses would be, well, since Reiki can do no harm, and you did set a good intention, right? So if you set your intention correctly and Reiki can do no harm, then what you experienced was just part of your healing journey or that other person's healing journey. And it was meant to happen. And so it was just part of the healing and just, it was okay. There wasn't any harm done. It was what was supposed to happen. Mm-hmm. And this to me was like a clear moment of spiritual bypassing, where this person is reporting harm or discomfort. And without trying to understand the situation any better, without trying to understand the nuance that might be involved, there was just this go-to, well, if you were doing Reiki, Reiki can do no harm. If you set your intention correctly, then that was just that discomfort you experienced was necessary for your healing. And while there certainly is the reality of necessary discomfort when we're going through healing. Anybody who's had a major physical injury knows that there's a great deal of discomfort with your body knitting itself back together. Same with the heart or the mind. There's also a great deal of discomfort, pain, harm that is avoidable and actually doesn't do us any good and shouldn't have happened, right? And so I started trying to make the distinction in these conversations between, and you just made this distinction, Reiki as an energy, Reiki as a phenomenon in the world, Reiki as that which animates and connects us. It is what you are. You are Reiki. It's what connects you to the web of life. It's what animates you. That phenomenon can cause no harm. We're on the same page there. But we often use the term Reiki to refer to our system of practice, the actions that we take on ourselves and for other people, right? A system of practice enacted by people with and for and on other people. And anytime we're talking about interactions between people, especially when there's vulnerability at play, when there's pain and suffering that are in the room, when there's disclosures of personal information, when there's physical touch on the body. Anytime we're in that kind of situation, there is the potential for us to make a mistake or intentionally do something or, accidentally do something that causes unnecessary harm for another person.
Yeah.
And when I bring this up, people fight me on it. Oh, they fight me on it hard. Not everybody. A lot of people say, thank goodness you're talking about that, right? But there's always a couple of people. Yeah, thank you. There's always a couple of people who are like, no, Reiki can do no harm. What are you talking about? And a couple of times, well, if you're equating Reiki to harm, then you must be consorting with dark forces, because nobody who's truly in the light, who's truly in Reiki, would talk about harm in the context of Reiki. And so you must be consorting with dark forces. So once again, we go back to, if you're not obviously successful, if you're not speaking the positive, then you must be getting punished for something, right? And it's fascinating that that's the response, that this distinction between an energy and human behavior can be so difficult for us sometimes. And I'm very curious about that. What's going on inside of a person who's going to argue that point? Does that person believe that because we're Reiki practitioners, because we've had an attunement, because we've learned practices, that we are enlightened and perfect? Have we transcended our humanity, because we're Reiki people, right? We are now, it's impossible for us to make a mistake. It's impossible for us to have our eyes closed in a Reiki session and drop so much into that, feeling of being in our session that we don't notice that our hand is now resting in an inappropriate place. And we're now 3 inches lower on the body than we thought we were. Right. And that person on the table is now having a flashback to a sexual assault because our hand is in the wrong place. This has happened to me. Like, this is experiences that I've had, that's not somebody trying to cause harm or consorting with dark forces. That's an honest human mistake, but that caused harm and needs to be, number one, atoned for. There needs to be action taken to make that right. And there needs to be change. There needs to be an adaptation in the way that those practices are enacted as a result. And, my mission is that we can make those adaptations before the harm is caused, right? We can do our best to make those changes before we cause harm, at least to do our best, because we can't ever guarantee, right? But we can put more consciousness around these things before harm has caused. And that's not giving into fear. The other thing people often say to me is that I'm fear mongering. I'm saying, hey, I'm stirring up fear, and it's going to discourage people from wanting to do Reiki if they start thinking about, oh, I might make a mistake that causes harm. And I'm concerned about that too. I don't want that to be what people receive. But I just lean back on my own experience and thinking back to early on experiences where something like this happens, harm was caused, I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't know how to handle it, and there was nobody else around to tell me what to do about it, because Reiki can cause no harm. And that's what caused me fear. Not being able to talk about it is what caused me fear. Figuring out what it is that I can do, getting that resilience, getting that grounding, being able to tolerate the discomfort of acknowledging a mistake and making it right. That's what brought me to the point of, just for today, I fear not.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not afraid of causing harm anymore, even though I know that it'll probably happen again.
And what's interesting is that there are so many Reiki business professionals out there who are so pro getting insurance. Why do you need insurance if Reiki can do no
Why
harm?
would that be necessary?
Why would it be necessary? So that just
Totally pointless expense if you're never going to cause any harm.
Right. And so, and I just want to bring that conversation forward, to think about it, to get curious about it, and to recognize that we are humans. We're first and foremost humans, and then the Reiki practitioner, and how we describe Reiki, how we accept a client into our practice, how we have conversations, how they lie on the table, all of these things, there's room to err, and we are human, and we need to be comfortable and not only self-evaluating our own practices, but then as teachers, really bringing this to the forefront of going, what can you do to make someone feel comfortable, to help create a scenario, the situation where it's less likely to cause harm because the potential is there.
Yeah. And we're more prepared to respond with grace, to make graceful adjustments when that harm does occur, right?
Yes.
Yeah, this is I created a series of videos on these topics on my YouTube channel. So folks want to dig a little bit more into some specific examples of these things. There's a lot more there. But it's, there's so much in this conversation, and I hope we get to continue having it in various capacities.
Absolutely. And so what is your YouTube station so people can go check that out?
Yeah, the YouTube is Heartscapes Reiki, and then heartscapesinsight.com is the website.
Beautiful. Well, it has been a delight having these difficult conversational topics, and I really welcome it. I welcome the conversation. I welcome the conversation with our community, to further develop and further to educate ourselves and to support a conscious minded approach to our actions, to our practices. And thank you so much for being the forefront of bringing this to the Reiki community. I so appreciate all the things that you are doing.
But you as well, making these spaces for these conversations to happen, welcoming them, naming them as important. It's really important.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us today. Thank you for everyone who is listening, and we will see you next time. Thank you all so much.